Now I'd like to welcome to the stage the panellists for the first panel on international broadcasting, public media and the news gap, mission and market gaps. Tony Berman from Al Jazeera, Rena Golden, formerly of CNN International, Tamara Gould of ITVS. We had a late substitution for Alyssa Miller. Noel Jenkins will be joining us from NPR. Steve Reddish from VOA, and moderating will be Sean Paris from Georgia State.
Good afternoon. We're running 2 minutes behind, so I'll be very brief in introducing our panel. And the goal is to have them talk about their experiences on this question of international broadcasting, public media, and the current news deficit, but also to open up the conversation to the audience fairly soon. So hopefully we can get some interactive conversations going on. I first want to start with a question for Tony Berman, who recently was the managing director for Al Jazeera English. He helped oversee the post-launch phase of the Global News Network and had tremendous experience establishing bureaus around the world. But also before that was the editor-in-chief and executive director of the Canadian Broadcast Company. And so he's one of those few individuals who has experience working in public media, both in a domestic context and, of course, in a very global context. And so if you'd like to remark or reflect on the synergies and the possible synergies and the differences in those two jobs, that'd be a great way to start us off.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really found Dr. Bollinger's comments really quite inspiring in the sense that I think that one of the things that sometimes gets lost in the debate here in the U.S. is that it actually is it's common in the world for countries to decide that the media, particularly in terms of coverage of the world, is something that cannot be left solely to the commercial sector. And one says that with great respect to the free market economy. It's not only Britain that has a robust public broadcast system. It's all throughout Europe. It's Canada. I mean, it's actually the norm. I mean, the U.S. is the exception in terms of industrialized countries in that there isn't, society hasn't made a decision that this kind of coverage is so incredibly important that the public needs to be protected. So that's why I find this discussion of whether the government should be in charge of the news media a bit of a canard, because it's the BBC. There is a firewall between the BBC and the British government, the CBC, and the Canadian government. And let me talk about Al Jazeera. I mean, I've worked. Al Jazeera is a publicly funded broadcaster. It's funded by the government of Qatar. I was managing director of that channel based in Doha for more than 2 years. There wasn't ever any suggestion of influence at all in terms of my experience, in terms of the experience of the journalists that I know and I've dealt with all the time. In fact, and I've said this often in discussions I've had in Canada, that if anything, as the editor-in-chief of the CBC, Canada's public broadcaster, I had more of a clear sense of what the Canadian government wanted out of the CBC than I do have, and I did have, of the government of Qatar as it relates to Al Jazeera. So, I think that in terms of, I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? But I say it with passion, not so much because I'm defending the kind of the corporate or political interests of Al Jazeera any more than I felt necessary to defend the interests of the CBC. But I do think it's crucial that we, in this period of our lives, in this continent, in December of 2010, realize how horribly served we are by the news media in terms of understanding the world. And I think the lack of alignment that Dr. Bollinger talked about is something. I now live in Washington. I no longer live in Doha. I no longer live in Toronto. But I'm very much a North American. I think there's a lack of alignment as well in Canada, in Canada as well. And I do think that there is an answer, and the answer is the answer that's evident in every industrialized country, except perhaps in this one, that the public needs some sort of protection in terms of the coverage of the world, and one has that through some sort of public funding of one kind or the other. There are different models. The BBC is the classic model. The CBC is probably a smaller version of that. There's the Jazeera model. There are all sorts of funding models which NPR and PBS are involved in. But to me, it is a lost proposition if at the end of the day there's no way that the American public, and I say this as well about the Canadian public, has an opportunity to spend its taxpayers' dollars to ensure the kind of coverage of the world that is crucial, as Dr. Bollinger outlined.
I want to follow up briefly with one more question for you. While you were directing Al Jazeera English, the network embarked on a series of new media initiatives that were seen by many in journalism as revolutionary, very innovative, ways to efficiently get new news coverage that previously had been difficult to get. Yeah. In particular, one initiative co-launched with Creative Commons. Yeah. So if you could speak to how new technologies and new platforms and kind of the new reality of the post-WikiLeaks world might shape the direction of international news, that would be
yeah. Helpful. The old reality is that we're incredibly competitive in the media, and that we basically, as companies, as organizations, we invest a certain amount of money, we get coverage, we protect that coverage for our own audiences. We're incredibly jealous and envious and protective about it. I think a flip side, and I think this was a decision made by Al Jazeera, which is a well-resourced organization. The flip side is that no, let's look at this coverage as being a common property. So in other words, our first example was, the most dramatic example for us was the coverage of the Israeli-Gaza conflict, where we were the only English language broadcaster on both sides of the conflict. We had 2 or 3 units in Gaza itself. We had about 7 units in Israel. We provided exhaustive coverage of both sides, not only the Gaza side. And this was a story that was essentially half the story. The Gaza part was denied to a lot of people because journalists couldn't get access. So what we did is we basically made all of our coverage available to everybody. The only kind of proviso is that if you're going to use our material, somehow discreetly credit us, explain where you got it from. And that's more or less our pattern. And we regularly send out every day. We send out a list of the top stories on Al Jazeera English, and anyone can get access to them, and anyone can run them. And I think to a great extent, it's again, without getting carried away, because I think journalism, daily journalism, is history on the run, and I think Al Jazeera has its flaws, as every organization does. But I think the premise of the Al Jazeera approach is that this is public property, that we have the privilege to have more bureaus than any other broadcaster in the world, and that whether it's in the Americas or in Asia or in Africa or countries that literally are never ever seen on networks in this country, that it's our obligation to make it available to everybody. And I think in that sense, I think people can benefit from it. And I think clearly our view is that we should be far more collectively, we should be far more certainly in terms of international coverage, far more collaborative in that regard, because the commercial competition among companies is not going to be decided on the basis of, dare I say, the fewer than 100 foreign correspondents that remain in this country working abroad.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Rena Golden. Rena's in the awkward position of having worked for CNN International and CNN.com, so she might feel compelled to defend the private news media and their international coverage here. But to be slightly more specific, you led CNN International's effort to regionalize their international news, launching bureaus in Hong Kong, I believe, in London, to tailor the international news to local audiences. And at CNN.com, you also led the initiative to digitize CNN's content, their library and archive, that kind of a precursor to things we see very commonly in today's news organizations. So if you would reflect on those initiatives lessons learned and kind of trajectories of where you think that trend will take us.
Sure. And while I'm the one person here, I think, who currently is working in the private sector, I think, like Tony, a lot of what Dr. Bollinger had to say makes a lot of sense in today's media environment. I don't think, and I feel very strongly about this, I don't think private media is the only option. I think there are many countries, as Tony mentioned, that are doing hybrid type of experiments, many new media companies as well, that are, journalism is supported not only by government grants, but by grants from the private sector as well. And I think those are really interesting models. So by no means am I a proponent of just the private media model. I think the advantage that CNN had, and CNN still boasts, and I'd like to reiterate that I'm not at CNN anymore. I was there until last year for 25 years. But the advantage that CNN has had in its sort of keeping its international bureau structure stronger than most other Western media is CNN International. The network that I was running, and the network that still broadcasts to about 205 million households around the world. Because of CNN International, CNN has kept that international infrastructure in place. That's what feeds the CNN International network, and it's very true, as many people have noted, that while 100% of the content that's produced by that sort of international news gathering service is used on CNN International, perhaps not as much of it, only a very small fraction is used on CNN Domestic, and we can discuss the reasons for that later. In terms of your specific question about regionalization, the one thing that we recognize, particularly in Europe and Asia, Europe has about 170 million households for CNN, in Asia about 40 million, is that in addition to the global news, and we very much defined our audience as rather an elite audience with interests outside of their national borders, but in addition to global news, our audience also wanted and was demanding news of their region, their immediate environment. And so we embarked on a regionalization strategy really in that sort of age-old effort to make the news more relevant to our audiences. So I and my colleagues launched a production hub in London and a production hub in Asia, basically to launch about 80 hours of morning news, business, which became a much bigger focus for us right around that time, and lifestyle programming for audiences that was specific to their region. Now, they were getting global news, but what we called global news with a local touch. That was tremendously successful, not only in driving the audience reach, probably increased about 35% over the course of the forthcoming 4 years. CNN was largely known as a hotel network prior to that, and expanded exponentially in households after that. But also, and we are private media, also enabled us to get the advertising support from local advertisers as opposed to multinational advertisers that we hadn't gotten in the past. So it's a strategy that has really worked, and I think a strategy that has certainly contributed to CNN being the most profitable international news channel, which allows us to put our money back into international news gathering, which CNN continues to do a lot of. On the digital front, when I went over to CNN.com, one of the things that we felt that CNN.com, which was first launched in 1995, had kind of become was it wasn't necessarily leveraging all the great content, particularly all the fantastic international content, which really differentiated CNN from some of its domestic partners or domestic competitors in the same way as it could. It was largely a newspaper on the web. So yes, my focus was to digitize as much of the content as possible, which came with some risks. I mean, obviously some business risks. Had a lot of pushback from cable operators who don't want to see necessarily the same material that they're paying for streamed live or streamed tape delayed on the web. But it's something that we had to and continue to have to push back on. And a lot of that is sort of, educating cable operators, offering other kinds of services to them. But, the media world has changed, and this notion of sort of saving or only making this content available on television as opposed to online, that train left the station a long time ago. And that's a message that has been hard to communicate, but that CNN has been communicating pretty intensely.
Yeah. Thank you. Just to move things along, Tamara Gould with ITVS International has done just terrific work on nonprofit, publicly funded documentaries. And the one thing many things I want to say, but one thing in particular is that ITVS International is a publicly funded organization that has managed to both fund documentaries domestically and abroad, and managed to facilitate the exchange of those documentaries in both directions, which, if you take a second to think about, is a rarity, because part of the issue we've been discussing today is the difficulty of the synergies between public media domestically and internationally. So congratulations on what has been a difficult feat. So if you could tell us a bit about the role, how that process took place, and then as a second question, the role of documentaries in the news-making process. How can the two coexist and be helpful?
Sure. Thank you, Sean. And let me just give a shout out. So many of you in the audience I've spoken to, we're so fortunate to have an audience of so many experts, and so I will try to take your advice, be short and pithy, and all that, to give you guys time for your questions and input. Maybe I'll start with your second question first, which I sort of interpret as why documentary? And I'll just go back to the Pentagon Papers for a minute, because it's a subject I'm so interested in. A documentary that ITVS funded was actually called The Most Dangerous Man in America, about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. One of the things I'm so struck by is the quality of the information itself, and how that really also defines the change in the era that we're living in, which is that the Pentagon Papers was a report and an actual analysis that really demonstrated the fact that our government was willfully conveying different information to Americans. So it actually was a coherent report that was an analysis of data. What we have today with WikiLeaks is data. We have individual cables. We have, and from the reports they published prior about the field reports from Afghanistan, again, individual field reports. But there was no evidence that the government was actually lying based on that information, and that the information itself was not in any kind of analyzed format. And the reason I think that it's been the year of the documentary consecutively every year for the last 10 years is because we are so inundated with information, but really not with analysis. And I'm sure there's about a million reasons we all can think of: the fact of our underfinanced reporters and journalists, the fact that people don't invest in the long-term research it takes, and in the intellectual work that we need our thinkers to be doing to provide us with that kind of analysis. But that is the role that I see for documentary makers. And maybe I'll shift now to how we built our program and conceived of our documentary program and the role that it was filling. And again, documentaries and journalists are not the same thing, but they certainly inhabit the same ecosystem and part of the same world and face many of the same challenges. I think the professional documentary makers also have the same experience of people saying, well, now that everybody has cameras and can, make films on their flip phones and publish onto the internet, why are documentaries so expensive? Why do they cost, between $300,000 and $5 million to make a documentary? And those are all great. Those are all great things. I think I come from the perspective that more voices are better, that we are all part of we're all engaged in this from many different points of view. I think there's certainly room for the citizen journalists and the independent makers who are making their documentaries at no cost. But there's also a really important role for funded filmmakers who are spending up to 8 years making longitudinal documentaries that tell us stories and provide deep analysis and insight into perspectives that we are just not able to get otherwise. And that was certainly our thinking. A brief word about independent television service and the role we play domestically, and then how we expanded internationally. And I hope that for many of you in the room who are working in this field, this might be an interesting model to think about. Essentially, we were created in 1967 by the Public Broadcasting Act to make sure that independent voices actually could get onto the airwaves. So the idea was, okay, we have a public television system, but how do we actually fund the people who are going to make the stories, especially those who don't have well-financed budgets and who have important stories to tell? And since that time, we've now funded over 1,000 documentaries that have all aired on public television. After 9/11, it became very clear that our world was globalizing and that Americans really were not getting the foreign perspectives that all of us in this room understand, certainly the importance of that. And we created something called the Global Perspectives Project, which we conceived of as a two-way exchange of funded documentaries, both to increase the understanding of the world abroad to American audiences, and then also to take the films and use them more effectively that were being paid for by the American public, by taxpayer dollars, for the films that we were funding for public television, and to use those more strategically abroad by removing the barriers to broadcast. Some of the things we did not do, we did not fund any channels, we did not build any television stations. We really saw ourselves as a supplier of content and working with existing broadcast partners. And again, I say broadcast partners because this was 2003 when we developed this project. And even in the last 7 years, the world has changed a lot, and we've really reconceived our program to include many different digital distribution platforms as well. But basically, our model was to try to take what was working about our U.S. program in terms of how we worked with independent producers, how we funded them, how we production managed their process, how we vetted the content, how we, secured, insurance to make sure that there was actually a there with the kind of storytelling that was taking place. But then we distributed them as broadly as possible in the U.S. So again, we created partnerships with Sundance Channel, with HBO, with Independent Film Channel, with about 9 major national broadcast networks in the United States, and tried to remove their barriers, so we provided them at very low cost or no cost. Whoa! Is everything okay back there? Yes? No? Maybe? We don't know.
Silence is always a good sign. Please continue. It's okay. I think no screaming. Right?
No screaming.
No.
Well, I'll continue unless I hear sirens. And we estimate that in the last 3 years, we have actually increased primetime broadcast of foreign documentaries by about 200%. Which is, again, it's a little bit of numbers on the back of an envelope. But some of the conversations I've had with all of the major broadcasters have been pretty enlightening and somewhat frightening in terms of their concerns about airing foreign documentaries, their perceived limits of interest from their audience. I could really tell you some horror stories, but one in particular was, in the offices of Court TV. And they said, we love foreign documentaries. We love stories of Americans abroad getting locked up. Do you have any of those kinds of documentaries? But even conversations with serious channels who are very concerned about limited appetite of Americans for foreign perspectives. And I think that the basic concern was summed up by HBO, who said our audiences don't want to feel that they're being forced to eat their spinach. They really want to, why do people watch television? And I think, we get into all forms of media consumption and what and when and how and why people are doing what they're doing. And I think it's interesting to reconcile that with the Pew data that shows us that Americans say they really want more foreign perspectives. and that they really want to learn more about the world around them. I think documentary can be a true Trojan horse in terms of bringing context to the news. And this is what I mentioned before, that I think we're all part of the same ecosystem, that if you can engage people in one story, you're not there to, explicitly educate or feed them their spinach, but they're actually really engaged and entertained by the story of one person, two people, a small story that can often paint a broader picture. And those are the kind of films that we're looking for when we're funding. I would like to say that we can fund thousands of documentaries through our international program. It's actually a public-private partnership. We were able to bring in several private foundations, as well as the Department of State, who helped us support the export of American documentaries to now we're in 23 countries, and working with regional experts to kind of identify which kinds of American stories will actually resonate and make sense in the parts of the world where they're airing. We've reached over 100 million plus audiences in those 23 countries to date, and it's been, again, very exciting. We're not funding any broadcast networks abroad. We go through existing channels and we provide our content to them at no cost. But I'll close now because I'm trying to be succinct, and I know I've already failed at that. But that the model of funding high quality content is a very, very important way to go. And we invest a lot of resources in infrastructure. The world has changed a lot. Many of those distribution platforms are there. And the question is, how do we actually provide the kind of content and relationships that are going to be needed so that people are actually watching?
Thank you very much. Lauren Jenkins is a late addition, but I think I've managed to get a sense for how important his work is. The chief, what's the correct title?
Foreign editor.
Foreign editor for National Public Radio. And just from background knowledge, while you've been there in the middle of the worst time in the news industry's history, NPR's managed to boost audiences by 11% in the last decade, and you specifically have tripled the number of foreign bureaus that NPR operates from 6 to 19, I believe. And so if you could comment on how you managed to turn lemons into lemonade, so to speak.
Well, I start with just my background. I spent all my career as a foreign correspondent until, with one exception, when I went off and published a newspaper in Colorado. But mostly I was abroad. I've worked for everything except television, which makes me rather an exception here.
Could you bring them up?
I worked for Wire Services originally. I then worked for News Magazine, and I worked for the Washington Post. And I've been at NPR now, running their international operations for 14 years. I came to NPR because they were looking for someone to restructure their foreign coverage and expand it. Despite the common excuse given by most network television and everybody else that there's no real interest in foreign news in the U.S., which I think is a great falsity, because in fact we perceived our audience wanted international news, demands it. So we set about providing it, and we've managed, while everyone else was cutting their overseas operations, to treble ours to, I think, I don't know where CNN stands in terms of foreign correspondence, but we're right below the New York Times, and I don't know about television, how many, there are very few network foreign correspondents, as we all know. They're just in ABC, I think, is in about three, I think they have 3 bureaus, maybe 4. Anyway, we've managed just to go out and do it, and find the money. Interestingly enough, despite all this earlier discussion with Lee Bollinger about the need for government-supported media, we're sort of a hybrid. We get some funding from tax money, but very little actually these days. And we've raised our money mostly from half of our income comes from our listeners. 50% of our budget is those terrible programs that get out there 3 times a year and ask for your contributions. The rest we get from foundation grants, big foundations, Ford, MacArthur, any number of others, and public funding from corporations. We've managed to operate. We've managed to grow with that. In fact, our audience has not grown 13%, but 50% in the last decade. And we've managed to expand, as I say, internationally. We're all over the place doing what I think is really good foreign reporting of the sort that this country needs. I agree with Dr. Bollinger's concerns that there are very few of us out there doing it. They should be more. And I think the issue is finding the business model to support it. As he pointed out, the Internet's cut out a lot of sabotage of business models of a lot of media organizations by siphoning off advertising, and they haven't really come up with ways of providing the funding that takes to put a foreign correspondent abroad. It's probably the most expensive reporting you can do. We operate very small, tight bureaus, and our rule of thumb is it's probably $500,000 a year to keep one correspondent in place in one country. So obviously if you're dealing with television, that grows exponentially because you can't do it with just one correspondent. You have to do it with a whole crew. So it's expensive, but it's something we all need to find a way of continuing to do.
A brief follow-up. How
Yeah.
have new technologies and the new realities of the current information ecosystem changed the mission of NPR, which is to say the fact that you now have to do a lot more fundraising from your listeners, for example? How does that impact your news coverage, the journalists?
No, it hasn't changed our mission. We have siphoned off a lot of money to expand on the web like everyone else has. I mean, we view it just as the web being just another distribution system for the news. It reaches a different audience, probably a younger audience than our radio audience does. But, you know, it's been growing, and the fact is more people come out every year and contribute, and we've managed to expand and keep expanding even through a recession.
Thank you. Last but certainly not least, we have Steve Reddish, who is the executive editor for Voice of America. Prior to his Voice of America position, he was at CNN in Washington, D.C., and so he has, again, an interesting perspective of working on both the private and public side of the mission. What I'd like Steve to talk a little bit about is some of the challenges that he experiences running Voice of America that you wouldn't have experienced running CNN, for example, how the different missions result in very different types of questions and challenges on a daily basis.
Aside from the federal bureaucracy, there really isn't a whole lot of difference in that, and as well as the audience that we're trying to reach. Listening to Susan earlier say that there are 100 or about 100 foreign correspondents working overseas for U.S. outlets. I've got about 250 foreign correspondents working all over the place in our for our 44 language services. Many of whom are not just reporting on the situations in their countries, but they're actually living it and have a unique perspective to give to not only the audiences that we're broadcasting to, let's say in Afghanistan, but we're able to present those audiences with the Afghan side of what's going on, as well as the U.S. side with our news gathering operation here in the United States. And for Voice of America, that's our primary mission, is to inform people of course, of news and information, but also to explain U.S. policy and how it impacts them. We invite responsible discussion and debate and criticism of that U.S. policy, along with the support of the U.S. policy in that explanation, and to tell about what makes America America and the institutions that make America what it is. So in that aspect, at CNN, we didn't necessarily have that kind of mission, but we did have the mission of trying to explain the news in a way that audiences would be, and I'm glad Tamara mentioned the word entertainment, because that is what all of us who are in the news business are doing. We are trying to entertain our audiences, whether it's in print or online or on television or radio, with news and information. And I've always felt that a story well told, whether it's a story about one person's travails or one person's experiences, a well-told story that can relate their experiences to whatever it is in the news that we're talking about is the best way to be able to explain the news and entertain our audiences with that kind of information. I remember as a producer at CNN the idea of doing a story about some foreign, although Rena remembers the word foreign was banned. Yeah, you could get fined for saying the word foreign on the air. So any kind of international news, you could hear the televisions click to another channel. But I always believe that international news has got to have some component of relevancy, whether it's just a good story or whether whatever happens in country X, how the various different steps to make it relevant to person Y who's watching in the middle of the country. And that was always my focus in being able to impart international news to a domestic audience. And that's something that I don't have to do at Voice of America. We have no domestic audience. We're not broadcasting or televising to the United States. So all our audiences have we've got to be able to put into relevant terms the issues that the United States is dealing with, as well as other countries in the world. What are those issues, and how do we make those issues relevant to some person in Zimbabwe, as well as some person in Pakistan, as well as another person in Burma? So that's been the biggest difference for me in going from public to private and going from Voice of America to CNN. And it's a huge challenge that I feel like we try and meet every day.
Yeah. I've got a couple of follow-ups, but I think it's time to open up the conversation to the audience so that we make sure there's some interactivity. If we can get some microphones, and when you ask a question, if you could say your name, where you're from, that'd be terrific. Yes.
I'm Hussein Abdul Hussein with Al Rai newspaper, and my question to Mr. Berman is to what extent would you say Al Jazeera has helped educate the people of Qatar about the importance of democracy? And by the same token, to what extent has Al Jazeera educated the people of the world about how come in the 21st century Qatar still lives under an autocracy? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think the presence. I mean, I lived in Qatar for a little over 2 years, so I can't speak beyond my period there. I mean, I think the fact that that Al Jazeera, which is an international channel, both Arabic and English, respected, however controversial it may be in parts of this country, is widely respected outside of this country, I think has been, in my perception, a positive view, a positive impact within Qatar itself. But I mean, again, you probably know this as well as anyone. I mean, Qatar is a tiny little country. It's 1.5 million people, of whom 200,000 people are Qataris. I do think that there is my perception, and as I although I have had considerable experience in the Middle East, my experience in Qatar was my first experience in the Gulf. I think it is, in relative terms, a liberal Gulf state. And I think that I think people more experienced than I would kind of plot the impact of Al Jazeera within Qatar from its creation of the Arabic service in 1996 as a kind of a liberalizing force. And it was a radical liberal move on the part of the Emir of Qatar to create Al Jazeera. Conversely, I mean, I think that I'm trying to understand the question behind your second question. I mean, Al Jazeera has covered events within Qatar, has covered events within the Gulf, has dealt with the state and the plight of foreign workers in the Gulf. And I think I think there has been coverage of Qatar on Al Jazeera, both Arabic and English. I think the reality is it's an international news channel. Qatar is a tiny little country. When one looks at CNN, one does not get overly absorbed by the coverage of Atlanta. They have an international. Not anymore. They have an international cachet.
Ted left.
No, that's right. Ted was on TV this morning. Actually, I saw him. So I think it's a balancing act, and I think that I think that there is a kind of a mutual relationship, and I think that as it develops, I think it's a positive one.
While we get the microphone, I think there's go ahead, bring the microphone. Right now is an important test case, actually, for Al Jazeera, because Qatar's in the news with the WikiLeaks controversy. So
if I could just...
Some of this will play out, I imagine, in the next few weeks.
If I could just comment on that, because, there's so many leaks that it's hard to comment on them. But I'll if you look very carefully at what was leaked, essentially what was leaked was a prediction on the part of the American ambassador to Qatar that in the months or years ahead that Qatar as a state may try to use Al Jazeera to serve its own interests, particularly as Qatar becomes more involved in Lebanon, peacemaking, et cetera, et cetera. It was a prediction. There was no, if you read it very carefully, there was no evidence of that happening. My experience, if you look at Al Jazeera Arabic, putting aside Al Jazeera English, which I think, stands on its own in terms of its own kind of award-winning kind of reputation. Al Jazeera Arabic has been thrown out of virtually every Arab country since 1996. There's almost a permanent state of tension, if not hostility, between the Al Jazeera Arabic service and the authoritarian regimes within the Arab world. The idea, and I think in my observation of working within Doha, although on the English channel, but working with my Arabic colleagues, is I've never met a group of journalists who are more independent and who are more determined to kind of rebuff any attempts on the part of any government, whether it's close to the Al Jazeera headquarters within Qatar or whether it's far afield in the Arab world. So when I look at these cables, and I'm particularly interested, I look at, well, what are we actually looking at, And I think the most significant one, and with respect to The Guardian, I think they torqued that story. They essentially, what they did is they said Al Jazeera influenced by Qatari interests. And when you look down and it's essentially one cable by one ambassador. That ambassador, Joseph LeBaron, I've been in several briefings with that ambassador. I've always walked out of the briefing saying that 60% of what this man says makes somewhat sense, 40% of it makes no sense. I would, with respect, put the Al Jazeera part in the 40% that made no sense.
Thank you. Question in the front.
Okay. Robert Schroeder with International Investor. Considering the tough business model that everybody's in who doesn't have government support especially.
We also have a tough business model because
Okay.
I don't expect to get any more money.
All right, fair enough. But are any of you, I know it's a competitive business still, but are any of you willing to share your correspondence? I'm wondering how many each of you have in terms of foreign correspondence, in order to help each other out or other news services. And the flip side of that is, are you careful about vetting not just your reporters, but who they speak to in terms of full disclosure so they're not getting paid by other parties, etc.?
If I could tackle that first. Again, not speaking for CNN now, but I can tell you from experience, CNN has a pretty long history of sharing its correspondence, and it goes beyond what you have seen recently with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes, and prior to that, Christiane Amanpour on 60 Minutes. We have over 200 affiliates internationally. That's not even counting the affiliates here in the U.S., and correspondence are shared every day with those affiliates. Sometimes, as is in the case of Alessio Da Vinci, for example, on loan to other news organizations for a year or 2 years. So that kind of sharing happens, and it because of the economics of covering news these days, I think it's happening more and more. I think the flip side of that is the competitive, angle. You want to have your own bespoke news organization, so you're creating original content that's different from what your competitors have. So you have to strike that balance very much.
We've done one experiment. We share a correspondent in Colombia with the Washington Post. It works perfectly well. He was a former New York Times. Juan Ferrero used to be with the New York Times, wanted to stay in Latin America. This is a good story, Venezuela and Colombia, but neither us or the Post had the money to put a full correspondent in there, and we worked out a deal. That could be a model for further. I mean, it's in terms of competition, it's great because one is radio and one's a newspaper, so we don't feel that competitive. We have different audiences pretty much. We also, there's some other things developing which I think are interesting. We've used it on our web more than on the radio. There's something like Global Post in Boston, which has set up a total internet foreign service, foreign reporting operation around the globe. And we've recently done a deal with them that we will take some of their reporting and put it on our web. And they do just, it's totally web-based. They have something like 70 correspondents, mostly freelancers around the world, but they're well-placed. Some are very good correspondents who've retired. Some are people who've always been freelancers. It's a mixed bag, but they do some really good reporting, and they're set up this operation. It's just about foreign news, and I think it's terrific. And they've so far found a way of supporting it.
We do this. We have the same kind of arrangement at CNN with ProPublica, and have supported several investigation pieces that we report together.
Many of the VOA stringers, the 250 stringers I mentioned before, many of them work for indigenous local media in their regions. We share resources in that way, where we'll have a correspondent who reports locally as well as reports for the VOA.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I just wanted to make a point about that. I think sharing, whether it's correspondence, but really in the new era, probably the word that we all have to address the most is partnerships. Mm-hmm. I've had a lot of experience now working with the private sector and trying to deal with the complicated rights environment that we're all operating in. But what is really clear is that where we really need to share is on subjects that we all care about as a society, and how do we roll out information from multiple perspectives. So, for example, right now we're developing a campaign around women and girls globally, and our idea is to have it be a public media campaign, but we need private media partners. We want social media partners. The idea, we're adapting Nicholas Kristof's Half the Sky book into a public television documentary, but we're trying to work with Oprah Winfrey. We're working with a variety of partners, and then hoping to really engage the online community in creating related stories and sharing stories. So it's not just owned by public television. And I think this is not the answer. It's just one model. We're experimenting with what a multi-year cross-media campaign looks like, and trying to find the pieces where we all play a role. I think the idea that one form of media becomes obsolete as another takes over, it's clearly not really happening that way. It's more like getting carved up, and people are doing a lot of things all at once, and we all have a different role to play. And so any institution, to go back to Mr. Bollinger's point at the beginning, the institutions that we support going into this new era really have to be able to handle a multiplicity of makers and audiences, but work together in a way that we're not really used to doing, because we're used to our own specific rollouts, and that is going to be so different going into the next few years. And I think we need a lot of experimentation to figure out what ownership models really work, because of course the business model, especially in these times, is more important than ever, but yet it will only lead to our own irrelevance if we don't, on the gatekeeper side, figure out how to open up the rights issues so that we can really share with all the other media makers.
Don't you think that's sort of driven by the audience?
Absolutely.
I mean, the audience does not care if they're getting this story on CNN television or digital or through a partner that has nothing to do ordinarily with CNN. And I think that's what's driving a lot of these experiments, and I think that's a very good thing for journalism.
I agree.
That's one of the reasons why I don't necessarily believe the sky is falling, just because the financial model of various different newspapers is not working these days, and we have an explosion of media and an explosion of information that's out there, And it's
One might add it's an explosion of a lot of bad media too,
Yes,
because anyone can write anything and get it out there, and that's another big issue about
which is why trust and accuracy and believability is going to be key going forward. And it's if the distribution model isn't working, then we have to find different distribution models. But I do think that good journalism and good storytelling is going to remain and going to grow in perhaps a different way than we're used to.
Great. We've got an eager questioner in the third row here.
I don't know how eager, but I'm Joe Bruns with WETA, formerly with VOA. And I'd like to follow up on the previous question, which I think was really fascinating, and a major component of it I think was not addressed. VOA and NPR are both world-class news organizations, both primarily involved in the radio business, not competitors. Would VOA and NPR consider a partnership in overseas bureaus and overseas reporting, especially since part of this discussion today is about government involvement in the news delivery business? I'd like to hear from NPR and from VOA about the potential for a partnership. And if not, why not?
I would support it because there's a real difference. VOA is there to serve, to give the American government's message to the rest of the world, and as such, if you'll excuse the labeling, it's a bit propagandistic in the world, and we try not to. Our mission is not to deal with the world. Our mission is to inform the American public about the world they live in. And I see our mission is very much about public education and a democracy, about the whole global world that everyone has to know and try and begin to understand, because it's going to affect their lives. It does affect their lives. And I just think the mission of Voice of America is totally different, and I don't think they would merge.
I think Steve's going to disagree.
I'll disagree about the propagandistic, although I understand the perception. What we believe is that good journalism is an American, good journalism, a free press, a free media, is an American principle, and that practicing good journalism does more for the United States than a lot of other things that can be done. The thing about I'm going to reserve judgment about a merger. That's an answer that has to come from someone who makes more money than I do, or has more power than I do. But the issue, I think, really is the difference in audiences. We're not going for NPR's audience. They don't count. Legally, we're not allowed to target our programming to an American audience. And while NPR content may be of interest to our audience overseas, it is designed and generated for an American audience. So we might be able to perhaps share raw content, share raw news gathering abilities, but when it comes to the actual production of that content and the broadcasting of that content, and whether it's TV, radio, or internet, we have two separate missions and mandates and audiences that I don't necessarily think that a merger or would do any either one of us much good.
Ellen Goodman from Rutgers University.
I'll talk loud. Rena, I was curious to hear more about when you said that a lot of CNN's international coverage does not make it onto domestic air. Why that was that an assessment of audience interest, or was there another reason?
I think somewhat sadly, I think, and to be honest, I think it is an assessment of audience interest. Mm-hmm. I think CNN domestic certainly airs more international news than a lot of American broadcasters. It tends to be from the same part of the world where America has immediate interests. But I think a lot of it has to do with the feeling that Americans aren't interested in this news. I happen not to believe that. And we can also get into the debate of, are you only going to give audiences what they want or what you think they want, or what they also need to be able to function in a globalized world and to function in their own democracy. But I think that's the main reason.
And just as a quick follow-up to that, I recall a conversation I had with an executive from Google, who we were talking before a panel, and I said, "So do you agree?" He said, "Oh, the thing that I love is when people say news is dying." I say, "Oh, thank God, news sucks. News is so bad, and news should die. Traditional news should die." And I looked at him and I was like, "Well, I think you're going to be alone on this panel," and he was, but his point was that there needs to be room for something new. And my question, that I think of is, if American audiences aren't interested in foreign coverage, is it because the way we're covering it isn't connecting to audiences? I think we are fundamentally interested in each other as humans. I think we are interested in these global stories, but how we're doing it, trying to take a traditional model and superimpose it on our globalized world, is obviously something is missing. And I think our traditional formats need to be reinvented. I personally think documentary is one way. It's not the only way. It certainly is one way that has been successful. I think of it as a little bit of the Trojan horse model, where people can't look away. They find themselves really engaged in that. But there's so much more that has not been invented yet as far as formats.
Agree. Yeah, I think citizen journalism has its place, and obviously it needs to be vetted, and there needs to be context to that. But I think documentaries, and not just hour-long documentaries, but short films, experimenting with the combination of what independent filmmakers are making and sort of professional versus citizen journalists are doing together. The environment is right for that kind of experimentation. And I really think it's incumbent upon journalists to make the important interesting in a way that people can connect with it. And it's a cop-out to say, they don't want it.
Yeah.
Can I just add to, I agree with both those comments. I think it's just absurd to say that in a country of 330 million people, that there isn't a considerable appetite and interest in America, in the world, in a country, as Dr. Bollinger pointed out, is so internationally involved. And as a Canadian who used to watch CNN domestic in Canada, in Doha, I watched CNN International. There's no comparison between the two networks. I think the comparison, with respect, the network that is seen here, is such a pale shadow of CNN International, BBC World, I would argue Al Jazeera English. And I think the issue, and their books, their studies, this is not new. The Americans would respond to creative news coverage. Now, I certainly accept the point about documentaries, but even creative news coverage with all of the constraints of news format, as long as there was some respect to the fact that younger people don't have necessarily the memories of some of the older people, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, it's got to be provided in context. At the end of the day, and I've somebody who's worked in the media for more than 30 years, including with some incredibly inspiring and brilliant American television journalists, there is one main reason why in my view, that American foreign coverage, particularly in broadcast, domestic, commercial broadcast television, it's the business model. That if you ever buy the argument that Americans are interested in foreign news, then you've screwed your business model, because it's so expensive. So it's much easier to let's cling to the illusion that Americans don't care. Let's cling to the illusion. The only thing they care about would be weather and crime and local. And that's such I think, again, to flow from Dr. Bollinger's point, that's such an undermining of the incredibly, heroic potential role of America. And that's why, organizations, and I think everyone on this panel are associated with it, that are trying to break out of that conventional wisdom. It really is an essential part of America kind of re-engaging with the world.
I feel like we're just getting warmed up, but we're almost out of time. I did promise Ivan Segal in the front row of Global Voices a question. And if you want to add your question right after this, and then brief responses, and then we'll
It's sort of a follow-up question and comment to the last, which is that I was living in Asia when CNN started working building its regional bureaus, and I noticed a qualitative shift, a massive qualitative shift in the quality of the content in terms of the personalization and humanization of stories that came out of that kind of content, from the tsunami through Kashmiri earthquake through a series of natural disasters. And I think that this goes very much to the point that was just made, which is that the way we portray international or non-Americans in our content in traditional international reporting is often of a faceless or a nameless individual, a victim, somebody who is very far away from our personal experience. That is not the case, in my experience recently, in the regional bureaus, both CNN and BBC and others. And I think that there's actually a strong case to be made. And I'm curious to hear what you all think about this, about the question of engagement of Americans with the rest of the world. That is, this fundamental question of how we perceive and how we portray in our American media these spaces, the individuals that are outside of our spaces, outside of our citizenship.
If you want to add your question real quick, and then we'll try to deal with this briefly.
My name is Julia Savchenko. I'm with the Russian service of the Voice of America, and previously I was a Washington correspondent for the BBC. And my question is for Tamara. You mentioned that you have a distribution network in 23 countries. And I'm just curious to hear how you work in oppressed societies, if you do it all. Like, say, do you collaborate with some broadcasters in maybe Russia? And does it work for you at all? Thanks.
Well, I'll be definitely speaking with you after the panel because we're just trying to create a relationship with Russia. It's been really interesting. We started with the distribution of our series of documentaries. We have 32 documentaries that we've been bringing abroad. We started in 3 countries to get a sense of what we were up against, what we'd be dealing with, and how we should create our system. What we came up against immediately was that people didn't want this coming from the U.S. government. And it was really interesting in our conversations with the Department of State, who had given us the funds not to make the documentaries, but just literally to distribute them. And we said, it's kind of killing us that if this comes through the Department of State, even though it's the support, and the Department of State understood that these documentaries, which had been separately funded, but and they weren't government propaganda in any way. These have been created by independent filmmakers, but that there was a direct contradiction of sort of the spirit of independence, but being delivered by the U.S. government. And so we talked about basically our need to operate independently, that we could go to broadcasters directly, not have the films come through the embassies, that the broadcasters would be able to air or not air all of the documentaries. And I thought of it like, okay, if somebody came to PBS and said, you need to air 16 documentaries in prime time, it would be a conversation ender. So we really worked pretty flexibly with each broadcaster we have, except for in a few regions. In Pakistan and India, we're working with satellite operators, but mainly they're on-the-ground broadcasters. We started with the equivalent of public television broadcasters because we're part of a network of public television broadcasters, but it became clear that in several countries, there's really not an equivalent, that the public television station really is the government channel. So we do a lot of research and vetting of the partners that we work with in each country. One of the questions we've gotten is, why don't you just go up on satellite to hundreds of countries with your documentaries? And our thinking has been that it's really about building relationships with the broadcasters, and we've kept it fairly small. I mean, we're only at 23 because we know them all. We've met with them now 3 times over the course of the 7 years since we've launched the project, where we've held summits to bring them together. We've actually worked on experimental projects. I won't go into all the details, but where we've co-funded projects where we've aired them in multiple countries at multiple times, and just tried to create kind of an informal ad hoc public network of international broadcasting to see how that might work, and to learn lessons about where the challenges are and where they're not. We did a fabulous project on water resources with 5 of our partner stations, in Colombia and India, and working with the capacity issues they have there. It quickly starts, you pull the thread and it becomes like, what about media training? What about more opportunities for our media producers? But one of the things that is very clear, and I think to a point that was made by Ivan, is that one of the most important things I can see is that there is such a hunger among the media makers to cross-fertilize and collaborate, and that this divide we have of American producers here and foreign producers in the rest of the world is really artificial in the globalized world that we live in. There was a study done by documentarytelevision.com that basically says that fewer than 5% of the producers who are producing for American television are non-American, if you take out the UK. And so there's just clearly a problem in terms of the actual products that we're getting here and that we're taking abroad. And so our effort to kind of increase that and then hopefully create an ongoing pipeline where those relationships are built and they then, are fostered independently is really, really a big piece of that. And I'm happy to talk to you more about Russia following the panel.
Ivan, I really liked your question, but unfortunately we're out of time. Hopefully we can continue the conversation. Am I right that we've got coffee? We're going to keep going. The coffee is soon to be here, maybe even here. So feel free to take a step out and grab a cup of coffee while we do a quick stage